Donald Trump walks into Area 51. What he discovers about NASA's secret program changes history. The digital clock on Trump's bedside table flickered to 2:17 a.m. He lay in his Mar-a-Lago bedroom, staring at the ornate ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't shake. The whispers had started 3 days ago. An old contact from his presidency, someone deep within military intelligence, had called with information that made his blood run cold. "Sir, I know this sounds crazy," the voice had said, trembling slightly over the phone. "But there's something happening at Area 51. Something they kept from you during your presidency. It's bigger than anything we've ever dealt with." Now, watching shadows dance across his ceiling, Trump couldn't get those words out of his head. He turned to his side, punching his pillow in frustration. Melania was away in New York, which made this the perfect opportunity. No explanations needed, no concerned looks, no attempts to talk him out of what he knew he had to do. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself, sitting up and switching on the lamp. His phone showed several missed calls from his campaign team. There were rallies scheduled, speeches to give, an entire political machine waiting for his next move. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. He walked to his window, looking out over the perfectly manicured lawns of Mar-a-Lago. Palm trees swayed gently in the Florida breeze, their shadows creating patterns on the grass. It all felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't wake up from. "Sir?" A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was John, his night security detail. "Everything all right? Saw the light on?" Trump opened the door, finding his guard's concerned face. "John, I need you to do something for me. Something nobody can know about." John straightened, his training kicking in. "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "Get me a car. Something ordinary, nothing flashy. And I need you to make sure nobody, and I mean nobody, knows I'm gone." John's expression shifted from concern to worry. "Sir, protocol requires—" "Forget protocol." Trump cut him off, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that had once commanded the highest office in the land. "This is bigger than protocol. Much bigger." An hour later, Trump sat behind the wheel of a nondescript black Ford Explorer, something so ordinary it might as well have been invisible. He couldn't remember the last time he'd driven himself anywhere. Probably years before his presidency. The leather steering wheel felt foreign under his hands. As he pulled out of Mar-a-Lago through a back entrance, a voice in his head told him this was madness. Former presidents don't just disappear in the middle of the night to drive across the country. They don't abandon their security details, their schedules, their entire lives based on a mysterious phone call. But something else, something deeper, told him this was right. The highways were nearly empty at this hour. Trump kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see Secret Service vehicles in pursuit. But there was nothing, just the occasional truck and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching before him. He stopped only when necessary, using cash instead of cards, keeping his signature red cap pulled low over his face at gas stations. People did double takes, but nobody seemed to believe their eyes. After all, why would Donald Trump be buying coffee at a truck stop in Louisiana? The drive gave him time to think. Maybe too much time. His mind kept returning to that phone call, to the tremor in his old contact's voice. "Sir, remember that briefing you requested about Area 51 during your presidency? The one they said was just a routine research facility? They lied to you. They've been lying to every president since Truman. But something's changed. Something's happening there that's scaring even the people who've worked there for decades." The desert appeared gradually, the lush landscapes of the Southeast giving way to the stark beauty of the American Southwest. Trump had seen Area 51 in briefings, of course. Aerial photographs, satellite imagery, the usual sanitized government presentations. But as he drove through Nevada, feeling the air grow drier and watching the sun beat down on the endless expanse of sand and rock, it felt different, more real, more threatening. He pulled over at a small diner about 50 miles from the facility. The place was nearly empty. Just a couple of truckers at the counter and an elderly couple in a booth. The waitress did a triple take when he walked in, nearly dropping her coffee pot. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. Trump managed a tired smile. "Just need some coffee, darling. And maybe some eggs." She nodded, still staring. "Are you really?" "Just a guy trying to get some breakfast," he said, sliding into a booth by the window. "Though if you could point me toward Groom Lake Road, I'd appreciate it." The waitress, her name tag read Betty, furrowed her brow. "Groom Lake? You mean where the—" "Sir, nobody goes out there. They say all sorts of things about that place." Trump stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream create swirls in the dark liquid. "What kind of things, Betty?" She glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "My brother works security out there. Not at the main facility, mind you, just the outer perimeter. Says lately there's been all kinds of strange activity. More vehicles coming and going. Military types looking worried. And the lights." She straightened up suddenly, as if remembering she shouldn't be talking about this. "But it's probably nothing. Just dessert gossip." Trump left her a $100 tip and a signature on a napkin. As he walked back to his car, he could see her showing it to the other customers through the window, all of them gathering to stare at him as he drove away. The road to Area 51 was exactly as unremarkable as it was designed to be. No signs, no warnings, just a seemingly endless stretch of desert highway that anyone could mistake for any other desert highway. But Trump knew better. He'd seen the classified maps, even if they'd never let him visit during his presidency. The first checkpoint appeared suddenly. A simple guard booth that looked like it could have been protecting any military installation in the country. Trump took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and pulled up to the window. The guard was young, probably mid-20s, with the crisp efficiency of someone who took his job very seriously. His expression went from professional to shocked in the span of a heartbeat. "Mr. President? I mean, former president, sir?" The guard's hand instinctively went to his weapon, then back to his side. "This is a restricted area, sir. Even with your former status, I can't—" Trump cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Son, check your protocols. My clearance is still active." He pulled out his phone, showing a series of codes his contact had provided. "These numbers mean anything to you." The guard's face went pale as he examined the screen. He picked up his phone, spoke quietly into it for a moment, then turned back to Trump. "Sir, I need to verify these. Please pull over to the inspection area." Trump did as instructed, watching in his rearview mirror as the guard made more calls, his gestures becoming increasingly agitated. After what seemed like an eternity, the guard approached his vehicle. "Sir, these codes, they're highest level clearance, but protocol requires me to inform my superiors of your arrival. They'll want to know—" "No, they won't," Trump interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "Because by the time they figure out I'm here, it'll be too late. Now, are you going to open that gate? Or do we need to have a conversation about your career prospects?" The guard swallowed hard, looked at his booth, then back at Trump. Finally, he nodded. "Follow the access road to Building 7. Don't deviate from the marked path. And sir, whatever you're here for, be careful." As the gate opened with a mechanical whir, Trump felt his heart pounding in his chest. The facility sprawled before him. A collection of unremarkable buildings that could have been anything. Warehouses, research labs, storage facilities. But somewhere in this complex was the truth. The secret his contact had hinted at. The thing they'd kept from him even when he was the most powerful man in the world. A young scientist was walking between buildings, carrying a stack of files. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Trump's vehicle, her files scattering in the wind. Their eyes met briefly through the windshield, and Trump saw something in her expression that sent a chill down his spine. Not just surprise at seeing him, but fear. Real, genuine fear. He parked next to Building 7, taking a moment to straighten his tie in the rearview mirror. Whatever he was about to find, he wanted to face it looking like himself. The desert sun was climbing higher, promising another scorching Nevada day. As he stepped out of the car, 2 armed guards approached him rapidly, their faces masks of professional concern. "Sir, this area is restricted to," one began. "Listen, folks." Trump cut him off, his voice carrying across the empty parking lot. "I know things. Big things. The biggest things about this facility that even your supervisors don't know about." He pulled out his phone again, displaying the coordinates and authentication codes that had gotten him through the gate. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. This was clearly outside their training. One of them spoke quietly into his radio, then turned back to Trump with a resigned expression. "Sir, we need to escort you." "I know where I'm going," Trump said, already walking toward the building's entrance. The guards fell in behind him, their footsteps echoing on the concrete. Inside, the facility was a maze of sterile corridors, each looking exactly like the last. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm as Trump walked purposefully forward. He didn't actually know where he was going, but decades of business and politics had taught him that if you walk like you know your destination, people rarely stop you. A young female scientist emerged from a side door, carrying a coffee cup. When she saw Trump, she froze, the cup slipping from her fingers and shattering on the polished floor. Coffee spread across the tiles like a dark stain. "Oh my God," she whispered, her face draining of color. "You can't be here. You can't." But Trump wasn't interested in the startled staff or their reactions. His eyes were fixed on something at the end of the hallway. A reinforced door unlike the others. While most of the doors in the facility were simple steel with electronic keypads, this one was different. Heavier, more serious, and marked with a simple sign that made his breath catch in his throat. Project Horizon, classified level Omega. The guards behind him shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, that area is strictly..." Trump turned to face them, drawing himself up to his full height. "In about 10 minutes, your supervisors are going to realize I'm here. In 15 minutes, they'll be scrambling to contain this situation. In 20 minutes, this place will be swarming with people trying to stop whatever's about to happen. So you have a choice to make, folks. You can either be the ones who tried to stop me, or you can be the ones who were smart enough to stay out of my way." The guards looked at each other, years of training warring with the unprecedented situation before them. Finally, the older one spoke. "Sir, we'll need to record that you acted against our direct advisement." Trump nodded. "Write whatever reports you need to write. But right now, I'm walking through that door." As he approached the reinforced door, his heart pounding in his chest, Trump couldn't shake the feeling that once he stepped through, nothing would ever be the same. Not for him, not for the country, not for anyone. The keypad next to the door looked standard, but Trump knew better. His contact had been very specific about this part. With slightly trembling fingers, he entered the code he'd memorized during his long drive. 259041836. For a moment, nothing happened. The corridor was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet breathing of the guards behind him. Then, with a heavy click that seemed to echo through the entire building, the door began to open. The last thing Trump saw before stepping through was his own reflection in the polished steel. An older man in a familiar red tie, about to discover something that would change everything. Then he crossed the threshold, and the door closed behind him with a sound of finality that sent shivers down his spine. What lay beyond would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about the world, about history, about the future itself. But that was Chapter 2's story. For now, he stood in the darkness, waiting for his eyes to adjust, knowing that whatever he was about to see, there would be no turning back. The guard's final words followed him into the darkness. "Be careful, sir. Some things we're not meant to know." The lights inside flickered to life automatically, illuminating a scene that momentarily confused Trump. Instead of the high-tech laboratory he'd expected, he found himself in what looked like an ordinary office space. Desks with computers, filing cabinets, even a water cooler in the corner. It was so mundane it had to be deliberate. "Mr. Trump." A voice called from behind one of the cubicles. A man emerged, tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and gray hair cut military short. "I have to admit, we've been expecting you, though not quite this soon." Trump's eyes narrowed. "Expecting me? Who exactly are you?" "Dr. James Wilson, project director." The man gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." "I imagine that drive from Florida was exhausting. How did you know where you came from?" Wilson smiled thinly. "Mr. Trump, we know every move you've made since you received that phone call. In fact, we arranged it." Trump felt his face flush with anger. "You set me up?" "We opened a door," Wilson corrected, seating himself behind his desk. "One we knew you'd walk through. Your curiosity has always been predictable." A young woman appeared with a cup of coffee, placing it in front of Trump without a word. He didn't touch it. "Cut the games," Trump demanded. "Why am I here?" Wilson leaned back in his chair, studying Trump carefully. "Tell me, during your presidency, did you ever wonder why certain files were kept from you? Certain projects? Did you ever feel like there were doors you couldn't open, even as commander-in-chief?" "Every president has that experience," Trump replied cautiously. "Indeed. But you never stopped pushing, did you? Even after leaving office. Always probing, asking questions, maintaining contacts." Wilson opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file. "We've watched you getting closer and closer to something you weren't supposed to find. Something nobody is supposed to find." Trump's eyes fixed on the file. His name was printed on the cover, along with a classification level he'd never seen before. "What you're about to see," Wilson continued, "hasn't been shared with any president since 1947. Not because we don't trust the office, but because what we do here, it requires absolute secrecy. The kind that can't exist in today's political environment." A door opened at the far end of the room. Another scientist entered, younger, female, with an anxious expression. "Dr. Wilson, it's ready." Wilson stood. "Mr. Trump, would you like to see why we brought you here?" They walked through a series of corridors, each requiring different security clearances. Trump noticed the temperature dropping steadily as they descended what felt like several levels underground. "In 1947, Wilson explained as they walked, "something crashed in Roswell, New Mexico. But it wasn't what people think. It wasn't a UFO, or at least not the kind people imagine. It was something far more complicated." They reached another security door. Wilson placed his hand on a scanner. "What we found," he continued, "changed everything we thought we knew about physics, about time, about reality itself. But we weren't ready for it. Not then, not now." The door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Trump stepped through and felt his knees go weak. Before him was a vast chamber, at least 50 feet high, filled with what looked like enormous tubes of swirling energy. Scientists in protective suits moved between the tubes, taking readings, making adjustments. "Welcome," Wilson said quietly, "to Project Horizon. The real reason Area 51 exists." Trump gripped the railing in front of him, steadying himself. What am I looking at?" "The future," Wilson replied. "Or rather, one possible future. You see, Mr. Trump, what crashed in Roswell wasn't a spacecraft. It was a message, a warning, and for 75 years, we've been trying to understand it." A loud hum filled the chamber, and one of the tubes began pulsing with a brighter light. Trump watched, mesmerized, as patterns formed in the energy field. Patterns that seemed almost like, "Are those numbers?" Wilson nodded. "Coordinates. Not in space, Mr. Trump. In time. The implications of what Wilson was saying began to sink in. Trump felt his mouth go dry. "You're telling me?" "That's right," Wilson confirmed. "We're not alone in the universe, but our biggest threat isn't coming from out there." He pointed upward. "It's coming from in here." He tapped his own chest. "From us. From our future." Trump stared at the swirling tubes of energy, his mind racing. Everything he thought he knew, everything he'd believed about power, about control, about the very nature of reality. It was all about to change, and this was just the beginning. As Trump stood in the massive chamber, his eyes adjusting to the ethereal blue glow emanating from the tubes, Dr. Wilson's words hung heavy in the air. The humming of the machinery provided a constant, almost hypnotic backdrop to the scene unfolding before him. "Dr. Wilson," Trump began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, "you're telling me that for over 70 years, this facility has been—" He trailed off, unable to fully articulate what he was seeing. A young scientist rushed past them, her lab coat fluttering. "Dr. Wilson, the readings from Chamber 3 are spiking again." Wilson's face tightened. "Excuse me, Mr. Trump. Sarah, please show our guest around while I handle this." He hurried after the scientist, leaving Trump with a petite woman who had been standing quietly to the side. "I'm Dr. Sarah Miller," she said, extending her hand. "I've been with Project Horizon for 8 years. Trump shook her hand, noting how steady it was despite the tension in her face. 8 years? You must have started right out of college." A small smile crossed her face. "I was recruited before I finished my PhD in quantum physics. When they show you what's down here, well, let's just say your entire worldview changes." They began walking along the elevated platform that overlooked the chamber. Below them, scientists moved between the enormous tubes like worker bees in a hive, their movements precise and purposeful. "These tubes," Sarah explained, gesturing to the closest one, "we call them temporal chambers. Each one is monitoring a different, let's call it a thread of time." Trump stopped walking, his hand gripping the railing. Threads of time? Like different futures? More like potential futures. You see, time isn't as linear as we once thought. It's more like a river, with countless branches, each decision creating new possibilities, new outcomes. They approached one of the larger tubes, its surface rippling with energy patterns that seemed almost alive. Sarah pressed a few buttons on a nearby console, and the patterns shifted, forming what looked like images. "Oh my God," Trump whispered, leaning closer. The images were blurry, like watching television through water, but they were unmistakably showing scenes of cities, people, events that hadn't happened yet. "This particular chamber is focused on what we call Timeline Alpha," Sarah explained. "It's one of the more concerning futures we've observed." Trump watched as the images shifted again, showing what appeared to be massive storms, floods, and scenes of devastation he could barely comprehend. Is this real?" "As real as any future can be," Sarah replied. "But it's not just natural disasters we're monitoring. There's something else, something that changes everything." She led him deeper into the facility, past more tubes and through another security checkpoint. The temperature dropped even further, and Trump could see his breath forming small clouds in the air. "What you're about to see," Sarah said, stopping before a massive steel door, "is why we brought you here. Why we arranged for that phone call that got you curious enough to drive across the country." She placed her hand on a biometric scanner, and the door slowly began to open. Cold mist rolled out, and Trump felt goosebumps rise on his arms. "Remember," Sarah cautioned, "what you're about to see isn't an alien. It's not a monster. It's us. What we become." The door finished opening, revealing a chamber unlike anything Trump had ever seen. In the center, suspended in a massive tank, filled with slightly cloudy liquid, was a figure. Trump's legs nearly gave out from under him. The being in the tank was humanoid, but its skin seemed to pulse with a soft blue luminescence. Tubes and wires connected it to various machines that beeped and hummed steadily. "This is Subject 1, Sarah said quietly. "Or as we've come to know her, Emma. She arrived 3 months ago." Trump couldn't take his eyes off the figure. "Arrived? From where?" "From approximately 100 years in our future. She's human, Mr. Trump. Or rather, what humans become after." Sarah hesitated. "After everything changes." Trump moved closer to the tank, his reflection overlaying the glowing figure behind the glass. Why is she glowing?" "Adaptive bioluminescence," a new voice answered. They turned to see Dr. Wilson returning, his face grave. "A evolutionary response to what happens to our atmosphere. When the skies darken, humanity adapts. Or at least, some of us do." "The skies darken," Trump repeated. "What are you talking about?" Wilson exchanged a look with Sarah before continuing. "In approximately 50 years, a series of events will trigger what we call the Great Dimming, a combination of environmental factors, solar radiation anomalies, and other elements we're still trying to understand." Sarah stepped forward. "Emma is part of a group that found a way to travel back, to try and prevent it from happening. But the process of temporal displacement, it's not perfect. She arrived in a coma, and we've been keeping her stable while we try to understand the message she brought with her." Trump turned back to the tank, studying the peaceful face of the being floating within. Despite the obvious differences, there was something undeniably human about her features. "Message?" he asked. "What message?" Wilson pressed a button on a nearby console, and a holographic display appeared in the air between them. Strings of numbers and symbols floated in 3 dimensions, rotating slowly. "We've only decoded parts of it," Sarah explained. "But what we have decoded, it's why we needed you here." "Me?" Trump's voice cracked slightly. "What could I possibly have to do with this?" Wilson's face was grim. "Because, Mr. Trump, according to the message, you play a crucial role in what's coming. Your actions in the next few months will either help prevent the Great Dimming or ensure it happens." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the machines monitoring Emma's vital signs. Trump stared at the floating figure, his mind racing with implications. "Show me," he said finally. "Show me everything." Sarah nodded and led them to a small conference room adjacent to the chamber. The walls were covered in displays showing data, streams, temporal measurements, and what appeared to be news headlines from possible futures. "It started with small changes," she began, pulling up a series of images. "Subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field, changes in solar radiation patterns. Nothing that would alarm the general public. But when you put it all together," Wilson continued, "a pattern emerges. These aren't random fluctuations. They're precursors to something massive." Trump sat heavily in one of the chairs, his eyes fixed on the displays. "And this, Emma, she came back to warn us?" "Not exactly," Sarah said. "She's part of a group called the Temporal Conservation Initiative. They discovered that the Great Dimming wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was triggered by a series of decisions, actions taken by key individuals who didn't understand the consequences of their choices. And I'm one of these individuals?" Trump asked, though he already knew the answer. Wilson nodded. "Your influence extends far beyond your presidency, Mr. Trump. The movements you inspire, the decisions you make, they create ripples through time that affect everything that comes after." Sarah pulled up another holographic display, this one showing what looked like a timeline branching into multiple paths. "Here," she pointed to one branch that glowed red, "is the path that leads to the Great Dimming. And here," she indicated a blue branch, "is the path that might prevent it." The difference between them. "You." Trump stood up, pacing the room. This is insane. You expect me to believe that the future of humanity depends on my decisions? That some glowing person in a tank is a time traveler? We expect you to look at the evidence," Wilson said firmly. "The same way you'd evaluate any business deal, any political situation. Look at the data, Mr. Trump. Look at what's in front of you." As if on cue, an alarm began blaring through the facility. Red lights flashed in the corridor outside. "What's happening?" Trump demanded. Sarah rushed to a computer terminal, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Emma's brainwave patterns are spiking. She's trying to communicate." They hurried back to the main chamber. The figure in the tank was glowing brighter now, pulses of blue light emanating from her skin in rhythmic patterns. "It's some kind of code," Sarah said, studying the readouts. "The patterns, they're similar to the message she brought with her. But this is new." Trump stepped closer to the tank, drawn by some inexplicable force. Emma's eyes remained closed, but her fingers were moving slightly, creating ripples in the liquid around. "Her! Can you decode it?" Wilson asked, his voice tense. Sarah worked frantically at the console. It's a warning, but it's not about the future. It's about now. Someone's coming. Someone who—" She never finished her sentence. The facility's main door burst open, and armed men in black tactical gear poured in, weapons raised. "Step away from the tank," a commanding voice ordered. "This facility is now under the control of the National Security Council." Wilson stepped forward, his hands raised. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't a military matter. This is exactly what we've been looking for," a new voice said. A man in a suit stepped through the door, flanked by more armed guards. "Hello, Donald. I see you found our little secret." Trump recognized him immediately. The current national security advisor, a man he'd never fully trusted during his presidency. "You knew about this?" Trump demanded. The man smiled coldly. "We've known for years. We've just been waiting for the right moment to intervene." Trump looked back at Emma floating in her tank, then at Sarah and Wilson, who stood helplessly as armed men surrounded them. Whatever was happening here, whatever future was trying to warn them, it was about to become much more complicated. And somewhere in the facility, unnoticed by anyone, one of the temporal chambers began pulsing with a new pattern. A future, shifting, changing, responding to the chaos unfolding in the present moment. The weight of what Trump had discovered pressed down on him like a physical force. In just a few hours, his world had completely changed. But as he watched the armed men securing the facility, he realized that understanding the truth was only the beginning. The real question was, what would he do with it? "Stand down." The National Security Advisor, Richard Hayes, ordered his men. "Our priority is securing the subject and all related data." Trump watched as the armed team began disconnecting equipment, their movements precise and practiced. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, stepping between them and Emma's tank. Hayes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Donald, we understand exactly what this is. A chance to control not just the present, but the future itself." Sarah pushed forward, her face flushed with anger. "You can't move her. The temporal stasis field is delicate. If you disrupt it—" "Dr. Miller," Hayes cut her off. "Your expertise has been invaluable, but your services are no longer required." Two guards moved to escort Sarah and Wilson toward the door. But Trump raised his voice. "Stop. Nobody moves until we understand what's really happening here." The authority in his voice, honed through years of commanding rooms and nations, made everyone pause. Even Hayes seemed taken aback. "Still trying to run the show, Donald." Hayes recovered quickly. "You're not president anymore. You have no authority here." "Maybe not," Trump countered. "But I know things now. Things the public might find very interesting. About time travelers, about government cover-ups, about what's really happening to our planet." The tension in the room crackled. Guards looked uncertainly between Hayes and Trump, waiting for direction. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Emma's tank began pulsing with a brighter blue glow, and the monitoring equipment erupted in a cacophony of alarms. "Her neural activity is off the charts," Sarah shouted, breaking free from her guard and running to the console. She's waking up." Everyone in the room froze as Emma's eyes snapped open. They were an impossible shade of silvery blue, and they fixed directly on Trump. It's too late. Emma's voice echoed through their minds, though her mouth didn't move. They're already here. The facility's main lights cut out, plunging everything into darkness except for the ethereal glow from Emma's tank. Emergency generators hummed to life, casting red emergency lighting across the scene. What's happening? Hayes demanded, his composed demeanor cracking. Sir! A guard burst through the door. We have multiple unidentified objects approaching the facility. They just appeared in the sky. Trump moved closer to Emma's tank, drawn by an inexplicable force. Her eyes followed him, and he felt a presence brush against his consciousness. We tried to warn you quietly. Emma's voice resonated in his mind. Now we must show you. The temporal chambers around the room began activating one by one, their swirling energies casting dancing shadows across the walls. Images formed in the air, cities crumbling, oceans rising, skies darkening with an unnatural speed. These aren't just possible futures, Sarah realized, studying the readings. They're happening, all at once. The temporal barriers are breaking down. Hayes grabbed his radio. This is Director Hayes. I want everything in this facility packed up and moved within the hour. Full containment protocols. You still don't understand. Emma's voice cut through everyone's thoughts. You can't contain this. You can't control it. This was never about control. Trump felt a strange sensation, like reality itself was bending around him. Through the facility's high windows, he could see lights in the sky. Not aircraft, but something else, something impossible. What are they? He asked, though somehow he already knew the answer. The others, Emma replied. The ones who didn't survive the changes. The ones who found another way to exist. Dr. Wilson stepped forward, his face pale, in the blue light. The Roswell crash. It wasn't from the future, was it? It was from a different branch of humanity entirely. Emma's glow pulsed stronger. Time isn't linear, Dr. Wilson. Neither is evolution. What you're seeing are your children, your grandchildren, your species, spread across 1,000 different possibilities. And they're all converging here now, because of what happens in this room. Hayes pulled his sidearm, pointing it at the tank. Shut it down. Shut all of it down. Stop. Trump moved between Hayes and the tank. Can't you see? This is bigger than your control. Bigger than all of us. This is about survival. The lights in the sky grew brighter, and a deep thrumming filled the air. Equipment sparked and failed throughout the facility. The temporal chambers pulsed with increasing intensity. Choice must be made, Emma's voice resonated. Here, now. By you, Donald Trump. The man who would either save humanity or condemn it. Not through grand gestures, but through the simplest of choices. Trump looked around the room, at the armed men with their useless weapons, at the scientists, with their failed attempts to control the future, at Hayes with his illusion of power. Finally, he looked at Emma, floating in her tank, a living bridge between what humanity was and what it could become. What choice? He asked. What am I supposed to do? The facility shook with a deep resonance as the lights in the sky descended. Through the windows, they could see figures emerging from the brightness. Some human, some decidedly not, all connected by an impossible thread of evolution and time. You must decide, Emma said, her voice growing fainter as the temporal energies built around them. Not between right and wrong, but between fear and understanding, between control and acceptance, between what we are and what we must become. Hayes raised his weapon again. Don't listen to it. This is a threat to national security, to the entire human race. No, Trump said quietly, an unfamiliar calm settling over him. We're the threat. Our fear, our need to control everything. That's what leads to the future she's trying to prevent. The room held its breath as Donald Trump, former president, businessman, and now potential pivot point of human history, stood between humanity's past and its possible futures. The conference room in Area 51 felt impossibly small for the weight of the moment. Trump sat at the head of the table, surrounded by NASA's top scientists and military officials who had been urgently summoned. His signature red tie hung loosely around his neck. He'd been pulling at it nervously for the past hour. "Let me get this straight," General Marcus Thompson said, his voice tight with tension. "You're telling us that for decades, NASA has been monitoring solar radiation anomalies that could fundamentally alter Earth's magnetic field." Dr. Sarah Miller nodded, pulling up another holographic display. "The patterns have been consistent since 1987. We've managed to keep it contained, but our models show we're approaching a critical threshold." Trump leaned forward, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the projections. "Why wasn't I told about this during my presidency?" The anger in his voice was palpable. But there was something else too. Hurt, perhaps even betrayal. Admiral James Peters, a man whose chest bore enough medals to sink a smaller person, cleared his throat. "Mr. President, former president," he corrected himself. "This program exists outside normal governmental channels for a reason. Every president since Reagan has been kept in the dark to prevent panic and maintain global stability." "Stability?" Trump's fist came down on the table. "You call this stability? We're sitting on a time bomb, and you're worried about stability." The room fell silent. Through the windows, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, oblivious to the crisis, unfolding within these walls. Dr. Chen, the project's lead physicist, spoke up. "Mr. Trump, you have to understand, this isn't just about the solar anomalies anymore. What we've discovered, it changes everything we thought we knew about our universe, about time itself." Trump stood, pacing the room. His reflection bounced off the polished walls, creating a strange kaleidoscope effect. "Show them," he said to Sarah. "Show them what we found in the lower chamber." Sarah hesitated. "Sir, that's classified beyond." "Beyond what?" Trump spun to face her. "Beyond the people who might actually be able to help us fix this mess? Show them." With reluctant keystrokes, Sarah brought up the footage from the lower chamber. The room gasped collectively as the image of Emma appeared on screen, her bioluminescent skin casting ethereal patterns across the tank she floated in. "Dear God," General Thompson whispered. "Is that human?" "Not yet," Dr. Chen replied quietly. "But it will be. In about 100 years, assuming we stay on our current path." Admiral Peters stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd. Time travelers. Evolution. Do you expect us to believe?" "I expect you to look at the evidence." Trump's voice boomed through the room. "I was like you. No. Ready to dismiss it all as science fiction. But I've seen things in the past 24 hours that..." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. Dr. Miller pulled up another display, this one showing a timeline of Earth's magnetic field variations. "The changes are accelerating. According to our calculations, we have less than 5 years before the first major effects begin manifesting." "What kind of effects are we talking about?" a younger military officer asked from the back of the room. "Global communications disruption at first," Dr. Chen explained. "Then weather pattern changes. Eventually, the atmospheric composition itself begins to alter. That's what leads to..." She gestured at the image of Emma. Trump returned to his seat, his face uncharacteristically grave. "When I ran for president, I had certain beliefs about climate change, about science, about what was real and what wasn't. I was wrong." The admission seemed to physically pain him. "But this is bigger than being right or wrong. This is about survival." Admiral Peters shook his head. "Even if we believe all this, and I'm not saying I do, what exactly are you proposing? We can't exactly tell the public that we're all going to start glowing blue in 100 years. "No," Trump agreed. "But we can start making changes. Real changes. Not the political theater we've been playing at, but actual, meaningful adjustments to how we handle our future. The cost would be astronomical, General Thompson pointed out. The economic impact. Trump laughed, but there was no humor in it. Let me tell you about economic impact. I've built buildings, golf courses, entire resorts. I understand money, but I've also seen what's coming if we don't act. There won't be an economy to worry about. Sarah pulled up another set of projections. We've run thousands of scenarios. The only futures where humanity survives without major evolutionary adaptation all involve immediate, drastic action. The room erupted in overlapping voices, arguments about feasibility, about authority, about the very nature of reality itself. Trump watched them, his mind racing with possibilities. Enough! His voice cut through the chaos. The room fell silent. I've made my decision. Admiral Peters raised an eyebrow. Your decision? With all due respect, sir, you're not the president anymore. You don't have the authority to. I may not be president, Trump interrupted, but I still have influence. People listen to me. Millions of people. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to start using that influence for something that actually matters. Dr. Chen stepped forward. Mr. Trump, if you're planning to go public with this, not everything, Trump assured her, but enough to start changing minds, enough to begin moving us away from the path that leads to. He gestured at Emma's image. General Thompson leaned forward. You realize what this could do to your political future? Your base? Trump was quiet for a moment, staring at the projections of possible futures swirling before them. Finally, he spoke. You know what I've learned in the past day? Sometimes the biggest lies we tell are to ourselves. We convince ourselves that power, money, winning, these are the things that matter. But they don't. Not really. Not when you've seen what I've seen. Sarah smiled slightly. You sound like them. The future humans. They told us the same thing. Maybe they're right, Trump said. Maybe it takes seeing the end of everything to understand what really matters. Admiral Peters stood, straightening his uniform. Whatever you're planning, sir, you should know, there will be resistance. Powerful people have invested a lot in maintaining the status quo. Let them resist, Trump replied, a familiar fire returning to his eyes. I've spent my life making deals, building things, fighting battles in boardrooms and ballot boxes. But this is the most important fight of all. And I intend to win it. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. The tension had been replaced by something else. Perhaps hope, perhaps fear, perhaps a combination of both. Dr. Miller cleared her throat. There's something else you should know. The temporal readings we've been getting, they're changing. It's as if the future is shifting, responding to the choices being made right here, right now. Trump walked to the window, looking out at the desert sun setting behind the mountains. Tomorrow, he would step in front of cameras and change everything. His supporters would be confused, his enemies suspicious. But none of that mattered anymore. Get me everything, he said finally. All the data, all the evidence, everything that can be safely shared without compromising national security. And start making calls. I want the world's top climate scientists, energy experts, and technological innovators ready to move the moment I go public. And Emma? Sarah asked quietly. What do we tell people about her? Trump turned back to the room, his decision made. The truth, or at least, as much of it as they're ready to hear. Sometimes, Dr. Miller, the only way to prevent a frightening future is to face it head on. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the Nevada desert, the group began preparing for what would come next. None of them knew exactly how the world would react to what they were about to reveal. But they all understood one thing. After tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same. The next chapter would bring that moment of revelation. But for now, they had work to do. The future, or rather, all possible futures, was watching. Sir? Dr. Miller said, checking her tablet. CNN is already asking questions about your disappearance. Your team at Mar-a-Lago has been deflecting, but they can't hold them off much longer. Trump nodded, loosening his tie further. The weight of the past 24 hours showed clearly on his face. How long until we can have a proper press briefing set up? General Thompson consulted his phone. We can have the media center ready in 3 hours. But sir, are you absolutely certain about this? Once you step in front of those cameras, there's no going back. Trump finished. I know. But we're past the point of hiding this. Dr. Chen entered the room hurriedly. Her lab, coat slightly askew. Mr. Trump, you need to see this. The temporal readings, they're stabilizing. They followed her to the monitoring station where dozens of screens displayed various data streams. The chaotic patterns they'd been seeing for hours had indeed settled into a more regular rhythm. What does it mean? Admiral Peters asked, squinting at the displays. It means, Sarah explained, her voice filled with cautious optimism, that the future is responding to our decisions. The timeline is adapting. Trump stared at the screens, remembering Emma's glowing form in the tank below. Can we see her? One more time before. He didn't finish the sentence. The group made their way back to the containment chamber. Emma floated serenely in her tank, her bioluminescent skin casting that now familiar blue glow across the room. Mr. Trump. Her voice echoed in their minds, though her eyes remained closed. You've chosen a difficult path. Did I choose right? He asked aloud, stepping closer to the tank. There is no right or wrong in time, she responded. Only choices and consequences. But your choice, it offers hope. Admiral Peters cleared his throat. Ma'am, or, future ma'am, can you tell us more about what's coming? Help us prepare? A small smile crossed Emma's glowing features. If I tell you too much, you might try to control the outcome. Sometimes the best way forward is to simply take the first step and trust in humanity's ability to adapt. Trump pressed, his hand against the cool glass of the tank. Will I see you again? Perhaps. Emma's voice was growing fainter, but hopefully not in this form. The future I come from. It should no longer exist once you speak your truth. Dr. Chen's equipment began beeping urgently. Her temporal signature is fading. She's returning to her timeline. Or rather, Sarah added softly, her timeline is ceasing to exist. They watched in silence as Emma's form began to fade, the blue glow dimming gradually until the tank contained only clear liquid. Is she? Trump couldn't finish the question. Gone, Dr. Chen confirmed. But not dead. Simply unmade. The future she came from is being rewritten. General Thompson checked his watch. Sir, we need to start preparing for the press conference. Our media team is waiting. Trump nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the now empty tank. Have any of you ever had a moment where you knew, absolutely knew, that everything in your life had led to one single choice? The room was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. I built an empire, Trump continued. Became president. Thought I understood power. But this, he gestured around the facility. This is real power. The power to change not just the present, but the future itself. Sarah stepped forward. The press will ask questions we can't answer. They'll want proof we can't provide. Let them ask, Trump replied, straightening his tie. For once in my life, I don't need them to believe everything. I just need them to believe enough to start asking the right questions. Admiral Peters organized his notes. We've prepared a brief that explains the solar radiation anomalies without revealing the temporal aspects. It should give us a foundation to build on. No, Trump said firmly. No more half-truths. We show them everything we safely can. The data, the projections, all of it. Sir, General Thompson protested. The panic will be nothing compared to what happens if we don't act. Trump cut him off. I've seen it. We've all seen it. Now it's time for the world to see it too. As they walked toward the media center, Trump could feel the weight of history, past, present, and future, pressing down on him. In a few hours, he would step in front of the cameras and change everything. His supporters would be confused, his critics suspicious, his enemies ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. But for the first time in his life, none of that mattered. He had seen the future, and more importantly, he had seen how to change it. The sun was setting over Area 51, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the magnitude of the moment. "Are you ready, sir?" Sarah asked as they approached the media center. Trump straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and nodded. "You know what the strangest part is, Dr. Miller? For the first time in my life, I'm not thinking about ratings or polls or what people will say. I'm just thinking about that empty tank down there and the future we might have just saved." The doors to the media center loomed before them. Beyond them waited the world's press, hungry for answers. But the real story, the story of Emma, of time itself bending to human choice, of futures unmade and remade, that would have to wait. For now, it was time to take the first step. The future, all possible futures, was watching. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert as news vans began arriving at Area 51. The world's media had responded to an unexpected call. Former President Donald Trump would be making an announcement from one of America's most secretive facilities. Inside the hastily prepared press room, Trump stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie. For once, his usual confidence seemed tempered by something deeper. "5 minutes, sir," Sarah Miller said, poking her head through the door. "The room is full. Every major network is here." Trump nodded, studying his reflection. The man looking back at him seemed different somehow, changed by what he'd witnessed in the past 24 hours. "Dr. Miller," he called as she turned to leave. "Do you think they'll believe any of this?" Sarah paused. "Honestly, no, not at first. But they don't need to believe everything. They just need to start asking questions." The press room was a buzz of activity. Journalists from around the world whispered amongst themselves, speculating about the reason for this unprecedented gathering. Security was tight. Each reporter had been thoroughly vetted and required to sign multiple non-disclosure agreements. "Ladies and gentlemen," a military officer announced, "the former President of the United States." Trump walked to the podium, but this wasn't his usual confident stride. His steps were measured, almost hesitant. The room fell silent. "My fellow Americans," he began, then stopped, looked down at his prepared remarks, looked up again. "No, let me start again. My fellow humans." A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the Trump they knew, the bombastic, self-assured figure who dominated every room he entered. 24 hours ago, I drove across the country to this facility because I received information that suggested something was happening here. Something that had been kept secret, not just from me during my presidency, but from every president since Truman. He gestured to the screen behind him, where images of solar radiation patterns began to appear. "What I discovered here changes everything we thought we knew about our world, about our future. And for the first time in my life, I find myself struggling with how to tell this story." A reporter's hand shot up. "Mr. Trump, are you confirming the existence of alien life at Area 51? A slight smile crossed Trump's face. "No. What I found here is both more mundane and more extraordinary than aliens. What I found here is us. Our future. Our potential extinction." The room erupted in questions. Trump raised his hands for silence. For decades, NASA has been monitoring patterns in solar radiation that suggest our planet is approaching a critical threshold. These patterns, combined with our own actions, are creating changes in our atmosphere that go far beyond what we call climate change. He nodded to Dr. Chen, who began displaying more technical data on the screens. "I know what some of you are thinking. Trump continued. Donald Trump, talking about climate science? The same Donald Trump who called it a hoax? Yes. Because sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, we have to admit when we were wrong. And I was wrong. Catastrophically, dangerously wrong. The room was dead silent now. Even the most seasoned journalists seemed stunned by this unprecedented display of humility from a man known for never admitting mistakes. But this isn't about being right or wrong anymore. This is about survival. Our survival. Not as Americans, not as individual nations, but as a species. Another reporter stood. Sir, are you saying the government has been hiding evidence of an impending environmental catastrophe? What I'm saying, Trump replied, his voice growing stronger, is that we've all been hiding from the truth. We've been so busy fighting our little political battles, scoring points against each other, that we've missed the bigger picture. And that picture is terrifying. He walked out from behind the podium, something he'd never done before in a formal press conference. I've seen things in the past 24 hours that I can't fully explain. Things that challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. But the details don't matter right now. What matters is this. We have a choice to make. All of us. Right now. Sarah and Dr. Chen exchanged glances. They hadn't expected this departure from the prepared script. Mr. Trump, another reporter called out, your supporters have long followed your lead on dismissing climate science. Why should they believe you now? Trump was quiet for a moment, considering, because I'm not asking them to believe me. I'm asking them to look at the evidence, to think for themselves, to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, we've all been wrong. He turned to the screens showing the data. These patterns aren't Democratic or Republican. They don't care about our politics or our beliefs. They're simply reality. And reality, as I've learned, has a way of making itself known whether we're ready for it or not. A young reporter from CNN stood up. Sir, there are rumors that you gained access to classified areas of this facility. Can you comment on what you saw? Trump glanced at the military officials at the back of the room, then at Sarah. They nodded slightly. What I saw, he began, then paused. What I saw was a future we have to prevent. A future where humanity survives, but at a cost none of us should be willing to pay. The room erupted again in questions, but Trump raised his hand for silence. I know you have questions. I know you want details, explanations, proof. And in time, you'll get some of that. But right now, I'm asking you, all of you, to do something more important. I'm asking you to look beyond the politics, beyond the divisions that have defined us for so long. He walked back to the podium, gripping its edges. For years, I helped create those divisions. I played on fears, on anger, on the desire to blame others for our problems. I was good at it. Too good. But what I've seen in this facility, it changes everything. A photographer's camera clicked rapidly, capturing this unprecedented moment. The choice we face isn't between left and right, between different political ideologies or economic theories. The choice we face is between survival and extinction, between adapting and dying, between facing reality and hiding from it until it's too late. Sarah stepped forward, handing him a folder of additional data. But Trump waved it away. You want proof? Look at the increasingly extreme weather patterns. Look at the changes in our magnetic field that are affecting migration patterns, communication systems, even our own brain chemistry. The proof is all around us. We've just been too busy fighting each other to see it. He straightened up, and, for a moment, the old Trump confidence returned, but tempered now with something else. Something that looked almost like wisdom. I stand before you today not as a politician, not as a businessman, but as a human being who has seen what's coming. And I'm telling you, we can change it. We must change it. But we can only do it together. The room was silent again, every person present sensing the weight of the moment. There will be those who call this a hoax, a political stunt, a desperate bid for attention. Let them. There will be those who try to twist these words, to use them for their own agenda. Let them try. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not speaking for effect. I'm not calculating the political impact. I'm simply telling the truth as I've seen it. A reporter from Fox News stood up. Sir, are you aware of how this will affect your political future? Trump actually laughed. A genuine, almost sad sound. My political future? 24 hours ago, I cared about nothing else. Now I understand that we're all part of something much bigger than politics. Much bigger than any one of us. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the journalists who had covered him for years. Some favorably, others critically. What happens next is up to all of you. You can treat this as just another story, another political drama. Or you can dig deeper. Ask questions. Look at the evidence. Because the truth is out there, and it's not what any of us expected. Trump stepped back from the podium, but didn't leave. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He opened the floor for questions without any time limits or restrictions. For the next 2 hours, he answered every question as honestly as security protocols would allow. Gone was the bombastic showman, replaced by something none of them had seen before. A man humbled by knowledge, driven by genuine concern for humanity's future. As the sun set over Area 51, casting long shadows across the desert floor, the world began to grapple with what they'd witnessed. Some would call it a breakdown, others an awakening. But everyone who was there that day knew they had witnessed something historic. The moment when the truth, in all its terrifying complexity, finally began to emerge. The future wasn't set. It could still be changed. And in the most unlikely of places, with the most unlikely of messengers, that change had finally begun. As the press conference wound down, an elderly reporter from the Washington Post raised her hand. She'd covered Trump for decades, through countless rallies, scandals, and controversies. Mr. Trump, she said, her voice carrying decades of skepticism, I've watched you for years. You've always had an angle, a personal benefit in everything you've done. What's your angle here? The room fell silent. It was the question everyone had been thinking but hadn't dared to ask so directly. Trump walked back to the podium, but didn't speak immediately. He looked tired, his usual bravado completely absent. You know, he finally said, I've been asking myself the same question. What's my angle? What do I get out of this? He paused, looking out at the sea of familiar faces. And for the first time in my life, I don't have an answer. Maybe that's what happens when you see what I've seen. When you understand what's really at stake. Movement at the back of the room caught his attention. Dr. Miller was gesturing urgently. He nodded to her. Ladies and gentlemen, in a moment, you're going to see some data. Real data. Not political spin. Not carefully selected facts to support a narrative. Just raw, unfiltered truth about what's happening to our world. The screens behind him came to life, showing complex patterns of atmospheric changes, magnetic field disruptions, and solar radiation anomalies. Dr. Chen stepped forward to explain the technical details, but Trump raised his hand. No, he said quietly. Let them see it for themselves. Sometimes the numbers tell their own story. The room was dead silent as journalists studied the displays, many taking photos or making notes. The data was undeniable, showing patterns of change that went far beyond normal environmental fluctuations. A young reporter from MSNBC stood up. Sir, given your past statements about climate change, why should anyone trust your sudden conversion? Trump actually smiled. They shouldn't. Trust the data. Trust the scientists who've been trying to warn us for years. Trust your own eyes and the changes you've seen in your own lifetime. He paused, then added, Don't trust me. I haven't earned that right yet. But maybe, just maybe, trust that something profound enough happened in this facility to change even someone like me. As the implications of what they were seeing began to sink in, The questions became more focused, more urgent. Gone were the political gotchas and attempts to catch him in contradictions. These were questions about survival, about future generations, about what could be done. We'll be releasing a comprehensive report, Trump announced as the session neared its end. Not just about the environmental data, but about new technologies, new approaches to energy, new ways of thinking about our future as a species. Some of it will seem impossible. Some of it will challenge everything you think you know about reality. He straightened his tie one last time and looked out at the assembled press corps. I know what you're all thinking. This isn't the Donald Trump you know. Maybe he's lost it. Maybe this is some elaborate scheme. Maybe he's been replaced by aliens. A small laugh rippled through the room. But here's the truth. I'm still me. I'm still the same person who built towers and ran for president and said all those things about climate change being a hoax. I'm just awake now. And once you're awake, you can't go back to sleep. The sun had set completely now, and through the facility's windows, stars were becoming visible in the desert sky. Trump looked at them for a long moment before making his final statement. Tomorrow, the world will start debating what happened here. There will be theories, accusations, attempts to discredit or explain away what I've told you. Let them come. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not fighting for victory. I'm fighting for survival. Not just mine, but all of ours. As the journalists filed out, many still shaking their heads in disbelief, Trump remained at the podium, looking at the now empty room. Sarah approached him quietly. That wasn't quite what we rehearsed, she said. No, Trump agreed. It was better. It was true. Outside, camera crews were already broadcasting live reactions. Pundits were being called, and the world was beginning to grapple with what they'd just witnessed. But inside that room, for just a moment longer, Donald Trump stood alone, thinking about an empty tank in a secret facility and a future that might now never come to pass. The truth was out. What happened next would depend on whether humanity was ready to hear it.